So we're still in the Middle Ages, but we're approaching this late period. We're moving today. We're going to talk about the Romanesque, which I consider the sort of high Middle Ages, sort of at its peak. It's fully defined. And then the Gothic is a transitional period where you're beginning to actually move out of the Middle Ages a little bit. By the late Gothic, you're practically in the Renaissance. I mean, Renaissance doesn't happen overnight. It's a couple hundred years where ideas are changing. So today, this is sort of my favorite period to talk about because it's the period dominated by monasticism, the rise in monasticism, the height of the power of the church in Europe, the Christian church in Europe, the pilgrimage movement, which is a fascinating moment in time, and all of what that implies in terms of the art and the architecture and the like. So that's what we're going to talk about now.
When did the Reformation start?
That's 16th century, 1517,
Okay.
1517, Martin Luther.
Mhm.
But we will definitely talk about that because
Yeah,
that
I was wondering when that was, where that stood. In
yeah,
relation to the-
16th century, another one of the next important, sort of moments in church history, and it will dramatically affect art. So we do need to talk about it because Christian art and Catholic art are like two different worlds.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's fun when we get to that too. Last time I did a little bit of introduction of these ideas, these sort of four important things that define this period. And I'd mentioned that after 1000, we have this sort of apocalyptic intensity to Christianity, almost an anxiety. When Christianity becomes darker, the emphasis more is on you're going to go to hell, the suffering. It's less the positive messages of redemption and the good shepherd and the like, and more emphasis on the passion and the death of Christ, and you're going to burn in hell, as we're going to see that in the subjects changing. And it's all part of this same change that led to the pilgrimage movement and monasticism. It's all coming from the same place. Even the Crusades come out of that desire. So you can see there's some overlap. Romanesque is beginning around this period. Romanesque refers to a period, but also a style of architecture. And we'll talk about why it's called Romanesque or Roman-like. And then Gothic, which is a name given to the late Middle Ages by the Renaissance. And it was a name, it was meant to be derogatory. It was an insult. The Renaissance really looked down on the Middle Ages. They thought they were backward, dumb bumpkins, and they called themselves the Renaissance. We are the rebirth of civilization, and you're just a bunch of barbarians, is how they saw Christianity of the Middle Ages. So we'll talk about that when we get there. Europe is still looking even more. Every time we look at a map, it looks more and more like a Europe that we can recognize. We still have the Holy Roman Empire, which is still very much a loosely decentralized governmental structure, even though it looks like it's a coherent, unified entity. It's not that unified. Of course, at this time, Normandy is part of England. France is becoming important. One of the things we're going to see as we come near the end of the Middle Ages is this, the power of the French kings is going to start growing, and that's going to happen in the late Middle Ages, in the Gothic period, but not quite yet in this Romanesque. Not till after about 1200 or so, 1250, we start seeing that power shift.
What's keeping rust?
Yeah, I don't know anything more about it than that. Cavian roost, it's just, it's, yeah, a little, that area of Western Europe, Western Asia, Eastern Europe that sort of falls in there. I don't actually, it falls between the cracks. It's like people who study Asia study East Asia, people who study Europe, and then there's this no man's land in between that specialists in either area don't really study. Somebody must, but I don't know who. And I would love to know more about that area and its history. It's really interesting and complex, And I know some of it, like when I teach India, I get into some of that, some of the history of like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and all of those regions, because that's really what we're sort of talking about, that area. But sorry, wish I had better answers. I'm not going to go into the Crusades other than to say there were 4 of them. Their ostensible goal was to, quote, liberate the Holy Land from the infidels. There was also a great deal of jealousy in the Western world of the Eastern Mediterranean. They were a far more advanced civilization, far more cultured, far richer. And really, Europe was still basically feudal and not that civilized, at least around 1000 or so. So there's a lot of jealousy of the East. In fact, the Fourth Crusade, they actually stopped over Constantinople and sacked. What did I miss? Forget. Okay.
Debating.
Okay. They stopped over in Constantinople and actually conquered Constantinople briefly for about 75 years, forced out the rulers in Constantinople, the center of the Eastern Christian Empire, mainly because they were jealous. And we're going to talk about that in more detail later when we get to the Gothic period, because some interesting things happened at that time. It's all, a lot of it was just jealousy of the Eastern Church. Even though they were largely a failure, some good things came out of the crusade. Certainly contact with a more sophisticated culture was good. And they brought back some of the sort of lost texts of the ancient world and the like that were being saved. But one of the good things it did was it helped eventually by 1200 to help bankrupt a lot of those feudal lords that dominated Western Europe, because they're the ones that were paying for the Crusades, and that eventually will help, and the feudal system will help destroy it. When you bankrupt the rich and powerful, they're not rich and powerful anymore. And it opened the door for a lot of sort of social change. So unintended, certainly, but it really did do that. So let's talk about monasticism. We know that monasteries began as early as the 4th century in Egypt. We talked about monasteries in England and Ireland, and those early formation of monasteries like in the 500s and 600s. But monasticism is widespread in Europe by 1000. In fact, very widespread. There are so many different monastic houses. By this time, there are distinct orders that have developed with differences. One thing that they all have in common is they basically all take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. However, those are interpreted in different ways. Some are more severe than others. Monasteries are basically mostly cloistered. You're usually cut off. Again, that depends on the order. Some monasteries are very strict and rigid, and the monk would mainly live their whole life in their private cell or room, almost never leaving it. Others more open, where maybe 1 or 2 members of the community would go out and interact with the public. The orders you see here, we have some early orders, the Benedictines, one of the very, very earliest, Augustinians, Dominicans. The earliest orders, Carthusians, Cistercians, and Benedictines, these were very cloistered orders. The idea of poverty must be taken with a grain of salt. It means the monks lived in poverty. They were expected to give all their money to the church, and in many cases, the monasteries themselves could be quite wealthy. And we know that many aspects of the church were getting very wealthy during this period. Remember when we were talking about those sort of pre-Christian burials where they were buried with jewels and precious things? Well, the Christians stopped that right away. When you die, you give your money to the church. You don't get it buried with you. So the church is starting to accumulate a lot of money early on, which led to the formation of a lot of these later orders, like the Augustinians, Dominicans, and Franciscans. And we're going to talk about the Franciscans more later because their power comes along a little bit later. But they are mendicant orders. Those are orders where They do not accumulate wealth. In fact, they're mendicants, they're sort of beggars. They go out and beg for food and the like. And that's a reaction against the other orders that are getting wealthy. It's really a protest. You guys are all getting wealthy. The mendicants were a kind of response to that. And so this sort of growth of monasticism is really interesting. We'll talk about the Franciscans when we get to the Renaissance, because their ideals are very responsible for a lot of Renaissance ideals. And then the Jesuits haven't even been created yet. They come along much later in the 16th century, and they're going to be very responsible for a lot of the ideology that defines they come along right after the Reformation in the 16th century, and they're going to be very powerful. We'll talk about the Jesuits later. This little map, all these little dots, that's just two things. That's just the Cluniac monasteries and the Cistercians. That's just a few, and yet there were hundreds of them. Typically, a single monastery might hold, an average was about 50 men or women, because there were also what they called nunneries for women. But some of them were really big. There were a few that had maybe 800 and 900. One had up to 900. That was the Cluniac order, the main church in Cluny in France. They were the head church of all of the other Cluniac orders. But it was estimated that at its height, 1 in every 4 people in Europe lived in a monastery or a nunnery. That's how many there were. Every family had someone. Every family was expected to have one child at least that went into the monastic order. It was huge.
What was their height then?
We're probably looking at it right after about 1000, between 1000 up to about 1000, 1100, 1200. Their power starts to decline after about 1200, and we'll talk about why that is. Now, why is the church so powerful? Well, this system of monasteries is one good reason why. Remember that this is still the feudal age, where you have a decentralized government, and you have this lord who's responsible for his territory and everyone who lived there, and he supported the monasteries on those grounds. But then the next lord was totally independent, and the next lord was totally independent, but they all pledged their loyalty to someone who called themselves a king, maybe, but they were still independently powerful. The only unified bureaucracy in Europe was the church. The church had a hierarchy. It was a bureaucracy. You had the Pope, and then you had the bishops, and then you had the abbots, and etc. So it was really the only institution, the only unified institution in Europe. And that made them very powerful. So they were responsible for a great many of the activities that we associate with government today. All record keeping, marriage, births, marriages, all records. They took care of the sick. They took any sort of education. That's where you were educated. Now, that education was for basically the sons and daughters of the wealthy. Not most people were just illiterate, but what education there was, it was through the monastery. Healthcare, it was a center for arts, it was a center for everything. It was just the monastery, and every town, every little town and village had one. It was this, in fact, the church, the abbey church in the monastery was the church for that village. Everybody went there, the monks, everyone else, as we'll see in just a little bit. So it's a fascinating moment in time. So let's talk about what a monastery looked like. One of the things we have to go by is this indecipherable drawing. I'll show you a better image of it in a minute, so don't worry about it. But I just want to show you the original. But it's a drawing from St. Gall, a monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland. Now I'll show you this is a drawing so you can see what it actually looks like. But it's not one particular monastery, it's an ideal monastery. Someone drew up this plan of what the perfect monastery would look like. So every monastery is a bit like this. It's a good sized monastery. They're not all this big, but they all are roughly similar to this. They center on the great abbey church. which has an entry way that accesses the exterior, because everyone living in that city or town or village would have to have access. And they don't really have access to most of the monastery, that's off limits, but they had a passageway that led them right to the church. The monks' life centered around the cloister. We'll take a look at a cloister in a moment. And from that, they could access dormitories, refectories, which is sort of a dining hall, etc., cellars. And then all of these around them are sort of work areas, because monks would spend their day in work, study, and prayer. They all had jobs of some kind. They were self-sustaining. But, you know, the wealthier monasteries owned a lot of land that they farmed or had people farm for them. So they had income from that. And also they could feed themselves from that. But they would also make, you know, wine and beer and all sorts of other things. You know, they raised animals. There were granaries and barns. Cemeteries back here, vegetables. This is infirmaries, physicians, bloodletting. Yeah, medieval, you don't want to get sick in the Middle Ages. Let's just put it that way. Not a good thing. We get the abbot's house. The abbot was the head of the monastery, or abbess, if it was for women, and the abbot has his own house. And here you can see right by it the school, again for the elite. A guest house. Now, this would also serve pilgrims, and we're going to talk about the pilgrimage movement. Well, let's talk about the pilgrimage movement right now. The pilgrimage movement was massive, and it began, there were holy relics earlier. Holy relics could be many things. I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of a holy relic. A holy relic is any physical thing that had contact with a holy person in the ancient world. So any of the apostles or followers of Christ, any of the saints, anything like that that they might have touched. Typical relics would be bones. Bones of saints were typical. Piece of cloth of the robe of the Virgin Mary, a piece of wood from the true cross, you know, anything physical. They really believe that if this physical thing existed then, if I touch it now, then there's a connection. They had an interest connection there between the physical, which I find interesting in a culture that largely rejected physicality in favor of spirituality. They still have this tie to the physicality of things like holy relics. Now, of course, most of them were fakes, and we know that because they just don't make sense. I mean, there are hundreds of finger bones of St. James. I mean, how many fingers did he have? I mean, things like that. You know, supposedly if you put together all of the pieces of wood of the true cross, you know, you could build a skyscraper or something, you know. So, but, you know, and there, obviously people knew that there were huge markets and fake relics. It was, some people got quite wealthy on fake relics, but nonetheless, the church actually finally passed an edict that said every church altar must have a holy relic. And that's, of course, when it all went crazy. So now there's a huge market for them. And the essential for you know, Christians is you needed to come face to face with this thing, and if possible, touch it. Many pilgrimage sites, you know, the relics were set so that you could, you know, physically touch them. And they were for a lot of different things, but many of them, I would say the majority, were related to healing, because, you know, this was not a pretty world. This was a world where there was a lot of sickness. There's no such thing as medicine. The physician was just as likely to kill you as heal you. So the needs for, you know, external help for the sick was great. Yeah, Bonnie?
Don't we have somebody's finger over at the Nelson? Oh my gosh.
Well, we have mummies. What's the difference?
In that medieval.
We have reliquaries. I seriously doubt there's a holy relic in it. If the church has declared it a holy relic, I don't think it would be in a museum. We have lots of reliquaries which once held holy relics.
Yeah.
That's fine. A reliquary is just a container. It's nothing but a container. But the actual relic, see, we can have the holy relics of the ancient Egyptian world, but we're not going to hold the holy relics of the Christian world.
Well, if this was in the, I may be
I
confused.
could be wrong too, but I would be
I thought it was
surprised.
some- I remember being amazed. I thought it was.
Well, I'm going to
somebody-
check it out
somebody's
because
finger.
it's certainly possible. I'm not going to say it's not true.
I don't remember.
I
It's
would be
been a long time.
surprised that they would
The
do that,
relics
that the
of the-
church wouldn't be, well, maybe the church knows they're all fakes and so they don't worry about it anymore. The churches still have holy relics. They just don't play the role they used to.
Well, the cathedrals and the big churches in Europe all have relics.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think they've taken the pieces of bone and stuff out of
Put them somewhere
They have them
safer.
left in them.
Yeah, they're still in the church, but they're safer. Yeah,
But
that
they're
makes,
really beautiful.
yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. So you've got all of Europe who wants to go visit these relics. And the ideal would be to take a pilgrimage once a year and go visit all the around and visit all the holy shrines. Now, if you were wealthy, you could do that. You would have carts and stuff, but if you're poor, you're walking and you're hoping to maybe do it once in your life because it was still a very dangerous place to be. I mean, you had this territory is controlled by this lord and this territory is controlled by that lord. And in between it is a lawless no man's land. So it's not a safe place to travel. So pilgrims traveled in groups. You know, if you've got a big group, you travel together, you're on the road. And there are so many of these monasteries and villages that typically pilgrims would move, you know, from one village to the next and spend the night there. It's about one day's walk between these little villages. And you'd visit the holy relics there at their shrine and maybe spend a day or two and buy some little touristy things that the monks would sell you. And then you'd move on to the next site and sort of that's it. You just move around Europe. And that's why they have guest houses. The guest house would be for the wealthier who could afford, you know, a little nicer, you pay for this. And then there would be a huge hostel, which would be basically like a big dorm just for the other tourists. I can think of them as tourists because they're really treated like tourists. It really was a tourist trade for the monasteries. They raked in money from all the pilgrims, and not only just for charging for food and, you know, room and board, but of course, they were perfectly willing to sell you. What are they called? The names just went out of my head.
Relics,
No.
souvenirs.
If they had them, they'd sell them. No, you know, when you buy your way into heaven, what's it called?
Yeah.
Indulgence.
Indulgences. Thank you. I have the name and then it left.
That
They're
was the underpinning of the Reformation.
Oh, yeah.
right, that movement against but that was one of the many things, one of the many things. But yeah, indulgences, which in, you know, indulgences, I'm gonna defend this for just a minute because I think we do the same thing in a different way. Indulgences were to get money into the church and give you something in return for funding what was seen at the time as a worthy institution. We do the same thing with tax breaks, and I'm going to argue that a tax break is an indulgence because we give tax breaks for giving to certain nonprofit organizations. It's like, I'm giving you a break if you will donate your money to this cause that we have decided is worthy. And that's an indulgence. It's a variation of that. I'm not defending medieval indulgences, but it is a way of getting money to the right people. By the difference is, are they really getting anything for that money? Like with a tax break, yeah, I'm getting cash for this. I'm getting a break on my taxes. With an indulgence, you get a piece of paper. Now, whether that piece of paper is really worth anything, that's a matter of belief. So yeah, you have to wait and find out when you die whether that really works. But indulgences were a common way of funding. These are some cloisters that are still standing from this period. They can be really elaborate, really beautiful. The cloisters were the heart of the monastery because monks would often circumambulate there, you know, sort of walking around in prayer and meditation. It was usually a quiet place, and then it connected to all the other parts. And then it was their direct access into the church, as we'll see. Pilgrimage routes developed early on. Why do you go on these? An act of penance, search for cures, spiritual devotion. And there was a really interesting,
Wendy, I do have a question about
Yeah.
that. The others, can we go back one slide because you showed those look like over the Nelson Atkins.
Absolutely.
They have with the horses in the middle though. You know, the horse with all the armor.
yeah, he's not in the middle. No, he's in the room next to it.
Who's in the room?
Yeah, he's in the room next to it. They wouldn't have had.
But is that a
No.
cloister or?
That's the little actual cloister there. That's a real cloister. Yeah, it's a small one. It's very typical of a small monastery, but that's a real one that was brought over. And then Roselle Court is designed. Now, see, architecture itself, you know, when we get to Renaissance architecture, the atriums of the Renaissance medieval I mean, not medieval, but Mediterranean architecture, they look very much like medieval cloisters. I mean, that's the typical building style of Mediterranean architecture. You see it in Roselle Court. It's all based on something like this. So basic pilgrimage routes developed. There were many sites where people wanted to stop. These are just a few of the main sites. There are hundreds. The most sacred site is the Cathedral of St. James, or Santiago de Compostela, out here on the tip of Spain. And we're going to look at that church that still stands, talk about that. But there were many other sites, and that's why this priest wrote this book about it. And, you know, he talked about, you know, safe ways to travel. He talked about the routes. You know, he gave advice about what shrines to stop at. It was your basic travel book, just like we would expect today, although only very, very wealthy people could afford anything like a book, you know, in the Middle Ages, of course. And there was a special guild of bridge builders that their job was to keep the pilgrimage route open, to make sure the bridges and things along that route were open. And there was a special order of monks, the Knights of Santiago, whose job it was to protect pilgrims on the road. Now, they couldn't be everywhere. I think they largely functioned in Spain, but that was one of their jobs as a monastic order, was to protect the pilgrimage routes along the way. So along the tip of Spain, these are the stops, the holy stops along that route. Out to Santiago de Compostela. As I said, we'll look at that in a minute, but I want to show you just an example of a reliquary. Anything that holds a holy relic can be considered a reliquary. You know, we looked at that crucifix image of Christ last time, that Otonian, that wooden one, and I said, because there's a story about it, about a consecrated host being inside, that technically is a reliquary, because the body of Christ is a holy relic, even if it's symbolized. Well, in the Catholic Church, it's not symbolized. In the Catholic Church, it really is the body of Christ. So that is a relic, but most reliquaries are like this, where it's a container of some kind that will hold one or two relics. And many of these saints, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of saints. There are many that we've heard of, but there are many we haven't. Every little village has its local saint, somebody from the past that died who they consider a saint. This is a reliquary of Sainte Foy. Sainte Foy, it just means faith. And she was supposedly a little girl or a young woman, really very regionally known around this one village, not a very well-known person. Some of them are human figures like this. Most are more like this. This is the one that is in the Nelson. It's considered a chasse. A chasse is sometimes called a box reliquary. They kind of look more like churches. They're not really boxes because they have that sort of pitched roof. It's beautifully enameled. I have no idea what it originally held. Maybe it may say there, I didn't even notice, but typically it's copper enamel, gold on wood with imagery. And again, we see there is a crucifix image, but this is late. Now we're in the 12th century. We're going to see more images of the crucifixion now after 1000. So various angels and apostles on either side. I don't know specifically. Yeah.
Was it meant at all to imitate or be a reminder of the Ark of the Covenant? And that looks
Now that I don't know a lot about the Ark of the Covenant. That's a piece of history that I'm not aware of.
I can see a relation.
Could be, I
Yeah.
just don't know,
Yeah.
but I don't even know what the Ark of the Covenant looked. I know what it looked like in
I don't know.
movies.
Everybody knows what it
But the
is.
real one, well, there could have been drawings or something. I just haven't studied that period.
In Exodus, the description of how it was to be built,
Yeah.
which we could never understand anyway, so many things that we can't measure and some kind of.
Oh, right,
unheard of,
right.
you
I
know, sort of
remember.
thing. And then it was ultimately lost before the Babylonian invasion.
Right.
of
So
the
nobody
first
knows.
temple, and it's never, no one knows what happened to it.
Right.
So
So our conception of it is something like this, but I don't know if in the 12th and 13th century, their conception of it was this. That's what it would need to be. And I don't know that. It could just be a church. It could be more than that. So let's talk about Santiago de Compostela. It's a typical Romanesque pilgrimage church. That is not what you're seeing there on the screen. That whole facade is 18th century. That is not what a Romanesque church looks like. Everything behind it and the plan is Romanesque. So it wouldn't have, I do want to show it to you and make that clear, because if you ever look it up and see that, that's totally not medieval. That's 18th century facade. But the plan is absolutely, it's only just that front facade that they rebuilt. The plan of the building is Romanesque, the interior is Romanesque, and they brought back our old St. Peter's. These are roughly to scale. Now, old St. Peter's was big. We looked at drawings of the interior. This is bigger. This is a much bigger church than old St. Peter's. You can see that it's still roughly based on the Roman basilica plan. It has a nave, it has side aisles. Now the transept is much more prominent, that crossing arm. What's different is this extension here, and we'll talk about this end and these little extensions, which weren't there before. Now that change has to do with the function of this building, which is unique. Romanesque pilgrimage churches, and I flipped it upside down so it would match this image. This is the apse end of the church now, rather the entrance end. So I want to talk about this end of the church, because this is the business end of the church. This is where everything happens down here. Now, by this time, churches like this, everyone enters through the apse entrance. This west entrance is increasingly not used. It's called the royal entrance usually, or it will be called that. It's a ceremonial entrance, but on a day-to-day basis, week by week, they use the transept arm because it's generally this area where people sit. Okay, let's talk about it. What we've got is a number of different things. Well, first of all, notice these really plain rectangular towers. That's the original design, not those ornate facade we saw a moment ago. That was all 18th century added. It was really very plain and austere. First thing we have that's new, that we didn't have in earlier churches, is what we call a crossing tower, or sometimes it's called the lantern tower. It's a tower that's built, and some of them can be very tall, right at the spot where the nave and the transept cross. That's why it's called the crossing tower. And some of them were very tall. In fact, in some texts, people talk about, in our village, the tower is 50 feet high. Well, in our village, it's 60. It seems like these were clearly the biggest structures in their town. And there was pride in the height of those towers. Remember, these were all originally within a monastery. None of them are today. They're just churches today, the ones that still stand, but they were originally abbey churches. This later becomes the cathedral, and we'll talk about what that means later. The function of the towers is, as it suggests, lantern. It's to let in light. These are now big buildings, and this spot is the farthest away from windows, and so a lantern tower, and we look inside, you'll see the light falling through that tower, and these four massive piers, which clearly function to support that massive tower. Now, notice this is the apse, but it's actually pushed way back, and there are lots of little chapels added to the side. What we have is a new area known as the choir. The choir is, and we'll look inside and see choirs in a minute. It's basically taking that half circle of the simple apse, pushing it back and creating a space between it and the transept. That's called the choir. And the choirs are going to become bigger and bigger. It's a place where the choir sits, but it's also a reference to the place in the church. It's the place at this point in time where the monks would go for their prayers 8 hours a day. Prayers at this time were what were called plain song, which is basically a kind of singing prayer. It's like you've heard Gregorian chants and things like that. It's singing. That's the prayers. And these were 8 hours, 8 times during the day and night when they had to go in there. And so this is where they would be constantly coming. Now, it's also a place where hundreds of pilgrims might filter through every day. And the pilgrims needed access to all of these, what we call radiating chapels. See all these little chapels that radiate out? That's why they're called radiating chapels. Every one of those would hold a relic, a holy relic. And pilgrims need access to them. So how do they get to them? Well, there's the choir. Let me move this and then I'll come back. They come in the side door. This is called the ambulatory. It's a walkway that circles the choir. So pilgrims can come in, walk around the choir and not disturb the monks in their prayers and stop and pray silently at each of these little chapels and then sort of go out the other side. So it's designed for the use of monks and the use of pilgrims, but it's also designed for the use of the resident community, the people who live there, who come for mass during the day. So we've got the long nave and the transept for that. So the design is more complex because it has 3 functions, 3 simultaneous functions that later churches don't have. Most churches today have 1 function for the people who come to service for the mass or whatever. This has to deal with pilgrims, their movement, and the access to relics, and also monks and their need to access the church as well. This is an image of the choir. Like if you've seen the interior of like St. Paul's or Westminster Abbey, or if you watch any of these royal weddings that have been going on, you notice there's part of the church where you have all the people, then there's the big screen, and then there's a whole other part of the church that those people can't even see, and you go past that, and then there's all these built-in wooden sort of benches that kind of face inward. That's the choir. That's where like the public officials, the important people get to sit for the royal wedding. It's where the prime minister gets to sit and others. But that's the choir, and that's what you see here. Now let's look inside. First of all of the images I'm going to show you of the interior of churches, whether it's Romanesque or Gothic, they're all artificially lit. When we take our photographs, we can manipulate them, we can use extra lights. None of them would have looked like this at the time. These were very dark places. Even with candles and maybe torches on the side, these vaults would have been very, very dark. So it's artificially bright. Even the Gothic churches were much darker than they seem, but the Romanesque definitely were. Now, why do we call this Romanesque? It's Romanesque. Romanesque means Roman-like, like Roman. And we haven't seen certain architectural elements since we looked at ancient Rome. One of those was vaulting. We haven't seen vaults in any Christian churches. They've all had flat roofs. So this is a return to vaulting. That's the main difference. That allows them to build bigger. They want scale, like the Romans wanted scale. They were also tired of Christian churches burning down with all those wooden roofs and ceilings, and this is a much safer way to build, but it's also just sheer scale. It's just a better engineering. Now, it's different in that it's not concrete. You know, Romans built from concrete. This is not. This is stone masonry. They're quarrying limestone and building it. This is the art and architecture of master stone masons who know how to build these things. They are basically 2-story, 2 elevations. let's look at another view and we can sort of see the elevation. Elevation refers to this side view. When I'm looking at this from inside, as if I've sort of cut it down the middle and I look at the side, it's a 2-story elevation that then extends into the barrel vault. This is called a ribbed barrel vault. Romans had barrel vaults. It's the same thing. It just has some little ribs in there for additional support and to identify each of these little bays. Remember I said at the time of the Romans created 3 vaults. That's all there ever were and probably ever will be. Every other kind of vault is a variation of a Roman vault. This is a variation of a Roman barrel vault. 2 stories. The lower story is the side aisles. This is actually the transept. We're looking in from here, the side entrance. This is the actual entrance that most people would have seen, because most people came in from the side. You can see the crossing tower and the light that's coming in here. So this is the view we have. Now we can see in this image, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4 bays. That's just because of where the picture's taken from. It does appear that there are more bays than that. At each bay is supported by a pier, or what it's really a compound pier. Look at this cluster. That's not like, in Roman architecture, that would have been a column, like 1 column that would have held up the arcade. Here, it's more complex. It's a compound pier. It looks more complicated than it is. It's either going to be, actually they alternate between a square pier with 4 half circles, or basically half columns attached on each of the 4 sides, or a round pier with 4 half columns. So the form isn't quite as complicated as it looks, but notice how the half column that's facing the transept or facing in actually continues. Let me look at this one, continues straight up. The capital is here on this side, but this one, capital's way up here, and then it leads you into that rib. It sort of draws your eye up. It's an architectural element that sets up this rhythm. You have these rhythmic bays that lead you down the aisle, and then these columns that draw your eye up and over across, and then the ribs set up this rhythm that sort of pulls you down. It's a beautiful design that draws you in. This building still has a gallery. The Romanesque buildings tended to have galleries. That is a kind of passageway or open area that you could access. You could go up there if you wanted to watch the service. The galleries are an old hangover from very early churches. It's going to disappear pretty quickly. Won't be around for very long. So all the Romanesque churches are similar, rounded arches like this, a lot of little chapels off both the transept and the apse in order to display relics, and sort of crossing tower. These are sort of the main elements that define this architectural style. Outside the church, now there's not a lot of art inside the church because they're very dark. You can't see anything. Most of the art in this early period is outside. It's going to be over the door. And the Romanesque portal was famous for that. Over the entranceway, you would have one over the main entrance on the west side, and then each of the 2 transept entrances would also have sculpture, something over it. And the Romanesque portal developed like this. Some are more complex than others. It's generally, again, a rounded arch. You know, they're going back to the Roman arches. Remember, Roman arches were half circles, perfect geometric forms. So are the Romanesque. They're that perfect geometry of Rome. It will certainly have the tympanum. The tympanum is the most important area. We're going to look at the sculpture of one of the tympanums. That's that sort of half circular area directly above the door. They may or may not have a trumeau. It depends how big the doors are. The trumeau is a support in the middle. If it's too wide, you need a support. Remember, that's the problem with a horizontal lintel, is it needs something to support. Some do and some don't. If it has one, there'll be sculpture there. There will typically be sculpture on the jambs, not always, early on not. we still use the terminology. Those are still called door jambs. That's still called the lintel. You know, we still use those terms, but the jambs here are much bigger, and there would be either sculpture on them or sculpture between them. Here you can see there's sculpture between them, later pieces of sculpture on them. Often there's sculpture on the lintel. On this one, you can see there's sculpture all around here. So there are places for sculpture outside, and they would have been painted. Yes, they were originally painted. Again, it's like so many things have been outside. There's no paint left on them. I want to show you the most famous and one of the foremost examples of medieval art. I think it's the most foremost example, certainly of high medieval art. Love this tympanum. Church of Saint-Lazare in France. Of course, Lazarus, Saint Lazarus or Saint Lazare. Saint Lazarus was the brother of Mary Magdalene. Because he rose from the dead, this was a very popular site for people who are suffering, for people who are ill. If you need medical help, you go to Saint Lazare. It was like the site for healing. The entranceway above the west portal is very, very famous and very Romanesque. It's one of the earliest of the new popular subjects. Remember, in early Christian art, the most popular subject was the Good Shepherd. Not so anymore. The most popular subject is now the Last Judgment, because this is the fire and brimstone. This is the judging. This is going to hell. We talked a little bit about the idea of, we're going to talk more about it, but the idea of narrative in art. How do you tell a story in art? We saw those bronze doors, those Etonian doors last time, where you had the little squares and each one had a story, and you put them together and you could read like a story, like the Bible is moving along. But what if you want like a whole scene and you want to tell a complex narrative? That's not easy to do. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. I'll talk about it again, but one of the hardest things to do in art is the visual arts is a narrative. You know, narrative or storytelling lends itself to other art forms more easily than the visual arts. Narrative lends itself to literature. You know, you want to tell a story, write a book. Theater, anything that unfolds in time, because narratives unfold in time. Stories have a beginning and a middle and an end. But if you're making a sculpture or painting a painting, you're doing a frozen moment. How do you communicate a story? How do you suggest this happened, then that happened, then that happened? And there are different ways people try to do that, try to communicate a narrative. And we're going to see in different interesting ways. And we've already seen interesting ways in earlier art. So the Last Judgment is a pretty big scene. There's a whole lot of stuff going on. So this, whoever the sculptor or group of sculptors were here, came up with this plan to divide up the space. We have an image of Christ in the center. Remember, no images of God, the Father, in medieval art. It's going to be Christ, the Son, stands for all three of the Trinity in the middle, and he's sort of gesturing. And on the left side, we have the saved, and we'll look at some details of these in a minute. On the right side, we have the damned, which is really the fun side. We'll look at that in more detail. Down here, we have the dead rising from their graves to be judged, if you've already dead. And then we've got the four apostles here with their symbols of their winged figures on either side. So it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, and there are little texts down here as well. I haven't memorized the text, so I want to see if I can find what it says. Somewhere here I have notes as to what this says. Yeah, I do. Okay, let's look at some detail. Here's the left. These are the saved. So we have these wonderful elongated figures. These are my favorite medieval figures. I love Romanesque figures. They're they're attenuated. They're what we call attenuated. They're stretched. They have all the tension of a rubber band. That's what I love about them. There's a tension in them, in those exaggerated, stretched figures. And to me, they're really powerfully emotional. I think abstracting forms like this is far more emotional than realism. It's not, realism has no emotion. It just is. When you pull these forms like this, it communicates, you feel that tension of that moment in time being judged. So there's lots of little details. Now, parts of it are broken off. You can't see the details they've worn over time, but there are figures being lifted up. Angels are helping people be pulled up into heaven. Mary is up here waiting sort of as the Queen of Heaven. So there's all sorts of calm and order over here. Here's some of the figures. You can see a little more detail here of them being lifted up. I'll see if I can find my notes as to what it says on the left. I thought I had it right here. No, I don't seem to. Darn, I really wanted to be able to read that to you. Anyway, if I find it later, it's just some comment about what's going on.
Where is that on the?
This is on the left side. On the whole thing,
Okay.
that's up high. That's right here. That's these figures right here. Yeah, because there's that wing thing. But the fun side is the damned. And you have them over here. You have St. Michael is over here. This is the scale. Part of it's broken off, so you can't see it very well, but there's like a scale here, and there are demons on this side who are trying to cheat. He's got his hand on the scale, trying to pull it down. And the angel over here, Michael's over here. And these are my two favorite figures. There's two little figures down here trying to hide behind the skirts of the angel. Aren't those the most incredible angels you've ever seen? Those are so much more beautiful than all those Renaissance angels. I will take these any day over Renaissance angels. They're magnificent. All sorts of little demons, these poor souls who are being grabbed and stuffed down into hell. Hell was visualized in the Middle Ages as a great mouth of a beast. It was called the hell mouth, and the great mouth of a beast. That was hell. And you've got a demon trying to stuff this guy in, and he's like locked his legs here. He's trying to keep from being stuffed in. You see whole cities that are being stuffed into hell, down into the building. And then these wonderful people, these terrified souls, here's an angel kind of moving them along. You can't see it in this picture, but these are little coffins, and the coffins that they're rising from, some of them have little emblems on them. When you visited certain holy shrines, certain shrines had little symbols that were associated with them. And the shrine at Santiago de Compostela, the symbol was a scallop shell. And you would get pilgrims who would visit there would get little scallop shell badges that they would attach like to their satchels or whatever. And some of these coffins have little scallop shells attached to the side. Now that of course implies this person's been on a pilgrimage, they've visited the holy site, they're most likely going to be saved. So there are little sort of symbols here that identify who might be saved. And then this guy that you can't really see him over here as well as you can see him over here. The contrast is better. These hands that are reaching down, grabbing him by the head, and he's like grabbing his knees, you know, trying to like make himself heavier so that he can't be pulled up to be judged. These are powerful images that were right over the doorway. Every time you went to this church, you saw this, you were reminded that this was very literal hell that you were going to. I mean, this is I don't think we can really comprehend today. I don't care, even the evangelicals, I don't believe they believe like medieval people believed. It's a very different connection to religion at this time. And this was a very real reality.
Always fire with Christians, I think, now. Well, there wasn't an alternative. burn to eternity.
Well, yeah, that was it. You lived this way or you burned in hell, quite literally. That image of Christ in the center is so interesting. You know, this is really the rebirth of large scale sculpture in this period. We didn't look at any large scale sculpture earlier in Christian art, did we? We didn't see any because there wasn't any. This was an art form that largely didn't exist. There was still very much a sense of idolatry associated with large sculpture. But in this period, we're seeing the return of large scale sculpture, particularly here in the form of architectural sculpture. So there's no models. They're not going to look back at Roman sculpture for a model. Those are pagans. So what's the model? The only model is Christian art, and the only Christian art is two-dimensional. So they're modeling it off of things like paintings, mosaics, wall mosaics, or images in manuscripts, but it's all two-dimensional. So an image like this is very, look how two-dimensional that is. He's perfectly flat. He's barely raised off the surface. So this is where the style is coming from. When we start seeing them becoming more three-dimensional, you know things are changing. And that's not really going to happen until we get into the Gothic. They're going to stay like this for the next 150 years or so. I have to show you a couple of capitals. Another place where we do see art in places like cloisters of the monastery. Cloisters always had historiated capitals. Historiated capitals are capitals, the tops of columns, that basically have stories. They're historiated. Histoire in French means story. It means you're telling a story or a narrative. So a historiated capital means a capital that tells a story. And in this one, you get this wonderful story of on the left, the flight into Egypt. And again, very influenced by all the two-dimensional imagery of earlier art, you know, the shrunken child, the misproportions, the flatness of everything. But the style is, I love them more than the two-dimensional work. And then I particularly love the sleeping magi on the right, where the angel awakens them and warns them not to tell Herod where they're going. But it's the point of view I want to look at. It reminds me so much of some of the things we saw very early in the class. I'm thinking of very, very early Egyptian piece. I didn't bring, oh, darn, I should have brought it in. I didn't, did I? No, but I should have. That Palette of Narmer, that Egyptian piece where you had some of the figures were seen from the side as they're marching, and then you had a group of prisoners who you saw from above, as if they were laid out on the ground and you were viewing them from above, multiple points of view. And that's exactly what we're getting here, multiple points of view. You're seeing the angel from the side, but the three magi from above. And again, because they're not trying to be realistic, they're trying to communicate information. They're trying to make sure you see the right number of people and understand what's going on and who everything are. I don't have any images of some of the cloister images that I'm familiar with and heard about, but a lot of the capitals and cloisters were warnings about the evils of women. A lot of them were sort of licentious scenes of women. And so those were for the monks. Those were made for the monks in the cloisters. Nobody else saw that but monks. So stories like these are for the general public. The monks get the kind of warnings that they need. And the general, they didn't need to be, they're monks, you know, they don't need to be warned about going to hell. They've already, you know, they're on the path. This is the populace that needs to be told these stories. The monks need to be warned about their behavior.
These are all carved. There's nothing sculpted. These are all carved.
Yeah, these are all carved. Well, carving is sculpting.
Well, okay.
It's yeah, it's
Yeah.
not modeled with your
No,
hands,
I-
but yes, it's carved.
Carved.
These would be limestone carved.
About how big are these? How many-
Listen, anywhere from like this big to bigger. I mean, if it's a huge, I've seen some that were, you know, massive. If you'll,
That doorway one, is that really huge?
the This one?
Yeah.
Yeah, now that's big. If you visited any Romanesque or Gothic cathedrals, you know that scale is deceptive on doors like this. I'll make that clearer when we look at some of the Gothic cathedrals, but quite often they're much bigger than you think they are. In our minds, we might visualize that as a standard door size. No. Often they will have a tiny little door down here that is the actual door. And this is like the big doors are almost never opened. There's a door within the big doors that gets opened. That'll be more obvious in some of the big cathedrals that we'll look at later. But yeah, the scale is, if I can.
Would there have been a need for a huge door like that? Was it always just a core to make the door so big and decorative? Or did they drive wagons in there or something? Ever?
That's a good, yeah, that would be big processions. I mean, they would carry big things
banners
in,
and stuff.
right? Or sculptures even of saints and the like. So
Okay.
I could see the need for that. Possibly that would certainly be one reason. No, I'm trying to find that image. I have tiny, tiny little images on my computer here. See, these are historiated capitals, and like on the corner one, this would be really, really huge. Others would be smaller, but they would be telling us stories. If I could find my way back to where I was on this tiny little picture. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about. So this dominates this period. When the church is in greatest power, and the sort of lords and their power is decentralized. All that begins to change as we get into the late 12th century because of some smart political moves. A lot of changes begin to happen in the late 12th century. First of all, the economy begins to revive a bit. There is population growth. There is considerable population growth. And most importantly, we get the first of the great urban universities begin to be founded. Some not until the 14th century, some 13th century. And I don't have the exact dates down here, but we start during the Gothic period to get the universities. Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, and Padua, major universities. Once universities begin to be built, intellectual life begins to shift from the monasteries to the universities. Also, certain kings in France begin to expand their territory. All these little territories here centered around, well, this is the Ile-de-France here in the pink. Louis, and I can't remember which Louis it is, the 7th, I think, but I have to look it up. He begins to expand his territory and to actually control more territory. Where it's the beginning of centralized government. Instead of the feudal lords being in absolute control, he takes over their land in more like the centralized government we have. And we really begin to have kings as we know them. The earliest kings understood the power of that and began and aligned themselves with the church. And that was a very fortuitous alignment for both of them, because he could take advantage of the sort of institutional structure of the church, and they could tap into his growing political power. So it leads to urbanization, and it leads to the rise of the power of the bishops. And I want to talk about the bishops. I don't know exactly when. Well, bishops had been around earlier, and a few bishops had always held very powerful positions. In fact, the Pope, the title of the Pope was merely the Bishop of Rome, is also known as the Pope. But a whole tier of bishops becomes powerful at this time. And bishops are not associated with monasteries or abbey churches. They're associated with urban churches, and particularly what we call a cathedral. A cathedral, by definition, is a church of a bishop. That's what it means. That's what the word means. Cathedra is Latin for throne, and it means there is a throne of a bishop in this church. And in a cathedral, there will be a literal throne sitting up there at the side of the altar. That means there's a bishop. And that position within the church replaces the power of the abbey. All these abbots in all these monasteries lose power to the bishops. And that shift of power of the church is very important. So all the church power is going to the cities now, not the monasteries, in the way it had been before. One of the abbots who plays a very important role was named Abbot Suger. And Suger, it was Louis VII. I can't believe I remembered that, right. Abbot Suger had an idea for a new kind of church. Again, not the facade of the building. That's the problem with these churches. All the Gothic churches, all the Romanesque, everyone you see is a patchwork of styles from different periods. Almost none of them are one style. Sometimes the two towers don't match. They're from different periods. The facade is one, the interior is one. I mean, these were massive structures that just got partially rebuilt, partially replaced as needed. And so they're all just a patchwork. It's impossible to find one that's totally one thing. But he didn't like the Romanesque churches. He also just didn't like the whole religion at that time. He wanted reform in the church. He didn't want it to be so dark, physically dark. He wanted more light in the church. He wanted that symbolism of light, which had been so important in the Byzantine church. Remember, they found ways to get a lot of light in. He wanted more light, and he just wanted a change. And so he worked with architects. Well, I'm not going to use that word. There were no architects in the Middle Ages. There were stonemasons. Architects come along in the Renaissance. Architect as an artist designer does not exist. Churches were built by master builders, people who went out and knew how to quarry stone and pile it up and build things. But there's no sort of artist out there designing churches at this time. So he worked with master builders, and this is the Church of Saint Denis. And the Church of Saint Denis is one of the most important churches in France. It's on the outskirts of Paris. It's the burial church of the French kings. It's all French kings going back to the time of the Franks are buried here. The Merovingian dynasty after Charlemagne, they're all buried below Saint Denis. So it's a very, very important church in French history.
Isn't he the one that carried his head there?
That what?
That carried his head, Saint Denis?
It sounds like something a saint would do. I don't know.
He died and he carried his head.
He's the patron saint of France, and it sounds right to me. I would believe that. I mean, I would believe that people believe that.
Well,
That he carried his head.
Get his head there somewhere.
It works for me. I love the saints. They just do the most incredible things. So anyway, the apse end of the church needed to be rebuilt. Not all of it, just the apse where the altar and choir. And so he said, let's try this new style, a new vaulting style that will open up the walls and allow more movement and more light. And when you look at the plan, one of the things you may see is all these strange little X-like lines. Now we know that on a building plan, when you see X's, it implies a certain kind of vault above it, and it's not a barrel vault. It's a groin vault. Remember the Roman groin vaults? Well, this new vault is a variation of the Roman groin vault. And this is what they look like inside. It's called a ribbed vault. Now, see all these ribs. Remember, a groin vault is when two barrel vaults cross one another, so that all of the downward thrust is funneled to four pillars or piers, so that it opens it up in four directions instead of just two. So that's what this is doing. But they're doing a little more than that. They're also changing the building material. Instead of using heavy quarried stone like those big Romanesque vaults, these are lighter weight. They use what's called webbing. And I'll show you more detail in a minute, but you can see the ribs here that identify a crossing. So let's look at it. Here's our Roman groin vault with all of the thrust on the corners. And now we've got the new rib vault with webbing. Now webbing is all the space and material in between the ribs. This is actually supported by the ribs, the crossing ribs, rather than, this is equally supported by the bricks. There's no one spot that supports more weight than the others. With this, it's like a series of ribs that really supports it. And that's quarried stone. The ribs are heavy limestone, they're strong. But to relieve some of the weight in between the ribs, it's filled in with lightweight brick. So those bricks aren't holding the weight, but they also aren't adding any weight to pull it down. It makes us stronger. We know that rib vaults are very strong. They're stronger than a barrel vault even, because they're pulled up. So the new rib vault is the new Gothic vault, and we'll see it in the cathedrals. But the other difference is the pointed arch. Now, you notice both Roman and Romanesque arches were perfect half circles. Not so Gothic. They're pulled up and pointed. They come to a point. Now, in truth, there are some late Romanesque churches that are experimenting with pointed arches, but for all practical purposes, we're going to think of it as just Gothic arches are pointed. There's a reason for that, because pointed arches are stronger, and I'll show you why in a minute. So let's look up. So this is what we see when we look up. So we see the transverse rib that goes straight across, and then we see the diagonal ribs and the webbing, the lighter weight material in between them. Now here's why pointed arches are stronger. In a regular arch or a half circle arch, this is our keystone, presses down, and the weight presses very much out to the side here, which is why you need support. But the higher you pull it up, the more you're redirecting that thrust downward rather than outward, the more presses down. Imagine you pulled that way up. Hardly anything's pressing out to the side. It's mostly pressing down. That makes them stronger. They don't need as much support on the side. Now, how do you get what is the perfect arc? Well, you find the perfect arc by starting with a perfect half circle. And if you overlap two perfect half circles, this inner arc is the ratio of what they use to make a pointed arch. And you can pull those apart or closer together to create a wider or narrower aisle inside. It allows you to pull the arch up without widening the aisle. See, the problem with a barrel vault is if I want this to be higher, then it also has to be farther apart. It's a solid form. So if it gets bigger, the walls go out. What if I want to keep a narrow nave, but I want a taller vault? Well, pointed arch allows you to do that. So let's put the pointed arch together with the new rib vaulting that will allow space to open up. And we'll look at the space in a moment. How do you build these things? You literally build them bay by bay. They're not built like a building today, right? They're not like a steel frame. Like you see a building today and you see the exposed steel grid, the whole thing before they start hanging all the walls on it. But that's not how they built these. They literally built the whole bay one at a time, because you have to have all this scaffolding under it to hold up the bay until you put in, the keystone to lock it. Then you take down the scaffolding, move over, build it up again, and build the next bay. Now, how tall can you build these? Nobody knew. They just experimented. And as we'll see, the direction of Gothic churches is bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until the last one kept falling down, and then they kept falling down. I guess we better stop now. So that's how they knew they had built as big as they could, and just keep going until you can't build them any bigger. And on this plan, this is typically what you'll see on a floor plan of, say, a nave. If you're walking down the nave, this is the transverse arch. That is the arch that goes from one side to the other. And then these are the diagonals that identify the groin. Let's look at an early church. One of the most famous at Chartres Cathedral. The true name of this church is the Cathedral of Notre Dame at Chartres. The true name of every Gothic church in France is the Cathedral of Notre Dame. They're all the Cathedral of Notre Dame in this city and that city. But because that's extremely confusing to have all the same name, we just call them by their city name. That's just so you know, but everybody calls it Chartres Cathedral. That is not a Gothic cathedral on the front of Chartres Cathedral. No cathedral has the same plan. So that's not Gothic at all. That's a Romanesque facade. And in fact, the two towers don't even match, which is fairly typical. But everything behind it is Gothic and was rebuilt as Gothic. You can see the massive scale, how it is dwarfed. Now, this is an urban cathedral. It was never part of a monastery or associated with a monastery. It's a city church. It has one function, and that is the people who serve the people who live in the city. You know, it doesn't need these multifunctional areas. There's no monks praying in here. There's certainly going to be pilgrims visiting it, but nothing like the pilgrimage movement. So one of the things that churches like this symbolize, you know, it still dwarfs the city. You can imagine what it was like in the Middle Ages. These were like mountains. These were considered holy mountains. And we've encountered that metaphor before of large structures as sort of symbolizing mountains. And sort of a lot of the architectural detail is very reminiscent of the details of mountains as well, and cliffs and ravines and the like. This is a model of Chartres with a cutaway view, so you can see all the parts of it. I know you can't really read this. We're going to look at some of the details of the parts, and I'm not going to go all the parts over, but it has similar parts, but one really obvious difference from the Romanesque: no tower. No crossing tower. Don't have that anymore because they found a way of letting more light in. They don't need a crossing tower. That was Romanesque. So we have the nave and the transept and a much more extended choir. I mean, look at how much there is. Remember the first church, the transept was right at the end. There was like nothing. And then the transept starts moving down and down, more and more. The reason we have so much more up here for the choir and the altar is that, we have bishops now and multiple priests, and the services and the mass are so much more complex and more ornate and celebratory. You need more space for all this to happen. They're still using the transept entrances primarily, though. The west entrance is still largely for ceremony. Here's some elevations, sort of cutaway views of some of the cathedrals over time. And so you can see the progression. Early Paris is one of the early tiny, Paris isn't tiny. If you've been there, the cathedral in Paris is not tiny, but compared to the others, Chartres, you can see the direction is not only getting bigger, but more elevated, more vertical, pulling up more and more, exaggerated. That's the other thing that a pointed arch does, is it visually pulls you up. It points upward to the heavens. There's something sort of elevating about it. Romanesque churches with their heavy barrel vaults, they were just that. They were heavy and they pressed down and they were dark. These are intended to emphasize and pull your eye up. This is a whole new kind of spirituality that's very intentional on the part of Suger and others, and others within the church and architects who are trying to create a new architecture for a new religion. And of course, it's going to be now a 3-level elevation, not a 2-level elevation, and we'll compare those. We still have the side aisle. The gallery disappears and is replaced by a much smaller area We'll talk about that in a minute. But what is new, you know, that would be the end of it in the Romanesque. You just have a barrel vault right here. Now we can have windows in the side because of our ribbed vaults, which are open on the side. Now there's a place for windows. And of course, those are the new stained glass. Here's a comparison of Santiago de Compostela. I should have put a scaled Old St. Peter's in here because it would have looked much smaller. So Old St. Peter's is tiny over here. Santiago de Compostela is big. Chartres is bigger. And wait till you get to, you know, the really big ones even later. But now look at the complexity of the plan. Look at all these X's. No barrel vaults in this building. They're all rib vaults. Everywhere you look is a rib vault. We've got, you know, single side aisle here. The transept is practically in the middle. We have such a large expanded choir. Smaller chapels, fewer chapels, because you're not, you know, function is different. We don't need all those. This is a cutaway view of a, quote, typical Gothic cathedral. It's not any one cathedral, but they all have these same elements. Cutaway view. The nave, of course, with its pointed arch. This would be the side aisle. This one has two side aisles. Some had one, some had two pointed ribbed vaults. This area, which used to be the gallery, is now known as the triforium. The older the church, the bigger this is. As the newer churches happen, and I think you can see it here, notice this is big, this gets smaller, 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 because it's not really an access area anymore. It's really not for people. It's not a place you can go anymore. It's not open. It's just a passageway to access parts of the church for people who need to get up there. It's a visual design element called the triforium. And from that, the most important new structural element is, of course, the flying buttresses, which are right here. It's a new way of taking the weight and flying it out for support. Remember, a buttress is something you put up against something else to support it. Now, we know that the weakest spot of vaults is at the spring point. So this is a weak spot for this. This is a weak spot for this. This is a weak spot for this. So at those spots, we want to take that outward thrust, and rather than put a big solid buttress there, we want to take the weight and fly it out away from the building. Why do we need to do that? Well, because we've got a bunch of windows in here and we don't want to block them. We need to take that weight and transport it away from the building to open up the side. That's the real reason. People don't talk about that enough. They talk about the structural support of flying buttresses, but you could have just slammed a big thick wall against the building and held it up. You didn't really need to fly it out, but you do if you want to open up the windows. Here's some flying buttresses. Now, see how that opens up the stained glass? Now you can get this is a clerestory. These are clerestory windows. It's an elevation to let light in directly onto the nave. And when they were all clean and in good shape, they let in a lot more light than most of them do today. Let's compare the two interiors. This is the Romanesque, artificially lit, of course, and this is this is Chartres. I have not been to Chartres in a very long time. I think I was last there in '89, and it was a great time to visit because they were right in the middle of cleaning all the windows. Half of them had been cleaned, and half of them hadn't. It was really fun to see them that way. Stained glass windows in general have been in pretty bad shape because it's been hundreds and hundreds, a couple thousand years, not really 1,000 years, of soot and grease from candlelight and torches that accumulates on the surface, and they just were dark. And so as they were taking them down and cleaning them, suddenly, you know, all this light is now pouring in to the building. This spiritual light, holy light, as they called it, was an important part of it. Now, when you see the vault, clearly you see the difference between the heavy Romanesque and the 3-story elevation that gives the light, and the rib vaults that make it possible. Here's a detail of these vaults, and I want to look at how the sophistication of this design. It's elegant. It's a beautiful design, not just structural. It's beautiful. We have compound piers again, where you have a central pier structure of some kind, and then sort of half columns on each side, one facing in, out, and then to the side. And remember, you follow it up visually. Notice on this one, right here, instead of being a single half column, it sort of breaks up into a cluster of what we call colonnettes, or little columns. There's a little cluster of them. There's a reason for that. Now, in the Romanesque, you have one column going up and it leads into one rib. Well, that won't work here because we don't have one rib going across. We have several. We have one transverse rib going across and then 2 diagonal ribs going off to the side. So right here, it breaks up into little colonnettes so that as you follow your eye up, right here, they all just burst out in different directions. It's really, it's like they explode across, over. It's a beautiful design, and it works to draw your eye up. It's elegant. There's a more ornate quality to Gothic art. It doesn't have that heaviness of the Romanesque. It is more decorative. It is more ornate, and little things like these column bundles that break at this one point and lead your eye up across are part of why these are so significant. I'm actually really catching up on time here, so I'm thrilled. Let's talk about the stained glass. When a cathedral like this was built, and it would typically take up to 100 years for one of these to be finished, because there's a lot of money has to be raised. As the church doesn't pay for these, I mean, the people are going to pay for these, and it takes, it's fundraising like any other time. And at any given moment, there might be 50 to 100 different guilds or tradespeople on site making different things. Things like stained glass were made on site. And you would have guilds for that. There are many different kinds of stained glass windows. Styles change over time. This is an early stained glass window. This is a rose window. The rose window, the round ones are the rose windows. These are, what we're looking at is the windows that would have been over the west entrance and the transept entrances. And these are called lancet windows. They're sort of shaped like a lance. They're tall and thin and pointed at the top. This is identified as early. You see a lot of this black area, a lot of black in between the glass. That actually was concrete. And you can see it like from the outside, that it's concrete, and these are set in. These are, if you've ever seen stained glass made, stained glass is a combination of colored glass and painted glass, both, starting with small units, pieced together to make larger units, pieced together to make larger units, with black lead lines holding it all in place. They are scenes, they can be anything from iconic scenes, like just an image of a cross or an image of a dove. They could be narrative scenes telling specific biblical stories. They could be abstract designs. They don't all necessarily have a scene of any kind in them. Or what a lot of them, especially these, have is a lot of them are political scenes. When the French kings tied themselves to the church, that also allowed them to link themselves to the saints in a way. And there'll be stained glass windows that tell the history of the royal dynasty, the history of the French kings. Political stories like that will be on cathedral walls. But my favorite scenes, and I don't think I have any images of that for you. My favorite scenes are, a lot of them are, especially, yeah, not the ones on the front entrance, that's an important place, but scenes of like, you'll see like a little shop, a scene of a little shop and people like hammering and like making shoes. It's a shoemaker shop, or a little scene and someone's building furniture. Now, why are these things? Those are what are called guild windows. Typically, every guild in the city was expected to donate a window. You give them money for a window. And if you donate for a window, if you donate the window, you can have whatever you want in the window. And so it was typical, of the Shoemakers Guild would donate a window, and it would be a scene of little shoemakers, which would identify who donated the window. That idea I want to bring back, because we're going to talk about that idea of privileges that you get if you donate for something. And we'll see that absolutely in art, because it won't be too long before you'll start seeing sort of images of people in paintings. It's like, who is that? Well, that's the person that paid for the painting. You get to be painted into the scene like a religious scene. So we'll see. That's not happening now because we don't really have painting. We don't have large scale painting in the Middle Ages. You have icons in the East, you have manuscripts in the West, and you have things like mosaics and stained glass and a lot of creativity, but you're not seeing large scale paintings, not now. That's going to revive later. But this is a lancet window. This is a tree of Jesse, which is typically in lancet windows. What we've got here is a scene of the tree of Jesse is a sort of family tree of Jesus. And it always starts with Jesse down here. And then his son is King David. And then usually there'll be 3 or 4 different kings in the lineage of David that symbolize all the others, because it's like 42 supposedly generations or something to Christ. And that's important, or it's not, it was important. It's important in the Hebrew Bible, not that important to Christians, but it was important that Jesus be linked to David, as the rightful king of the Jews. So that tradition is still continued here. So the tree of Jesse is often depicted, and you've got a couple different images here. So this is Jesse here, and this is sometimes said to be the origin of the whole idea of a family tree. Comes from the tree of Jesse motifs, which are first depicted in the Middle Ages, and from that the idea of the tree of life. Now, not the tree of life, but the family tree. The tree of life, that is a different concept. That is more universal, thinking of life itself as a tree. And that crosses cultures, and that's universal. We see that in cultures all around the world that use the idea of a tree as symbolizing life. But family tree as a document, in a sense, really sort of comes from this point of view. So yeah, stained glass is a beautiful art form in its own right. And it's perfect for medieval art because it's very flat and they don't care. That's okay with them. Medieval art isn't trying to be three-dimensional or look realistic or believable. So things like mosaics, which are inherently flat images, things like stained glass, which are inherently flat images, these are perfect for this period. Here's a detail of one. Now I'm going to tell you about Crown of Thorns. Anybody know where the Crown of Thorns is now? Yeah, you do, because I just told you here. It's in Paris. But yeah, I got caught up in this deep dive of following this, sort of refreshing my memory and going back. The first, I have no idea if there are any records as to what happened to the Crown of Thorns after the crucifixion. All I know is the first record that I'm aware of, but then I'm not a medievalist. I'm sure a real medievalist knows a whole lot more about this. The first thing I could find is that in 1063, it was brought to Constantinople, because by that time, Jerusalem was part of the Byzantine Empire, and Constantinople's where the emperor is. That's the center of the empire. So it was brought there. And then during the Crusades, after the Second Crusade was over, the emperor at that time sold it to King Louis IX of France, who brought it back to Paris. And this further enhanced the power of the French kings. This is one more step that really enhanced them. Pope Innocent IV. I mean, when you say something like this, Louis IX has been crowned by Christ with his own crown. It's reminiscent of when, Charlemagne is linking himself to Constantine as the rightful successor of Constantine as the head of the Western Roman Empire. We're going to see the same thing later. In this class at the moment, I'm not planning on going this far, but Napoleon has himself crowned. Napoleon crowns himself with the same crown associated with Constantine. They're all trying to draw connections with these major figures going back to Constantine, and then Charlemagne, and then, all the way up through. Napoleon notoriously took the crown from the Pope and put it on his own head, which was the next level of symbol that, no one has the power to crown me. If he had let the Pope crown him, it would have suggested the Pope had the power to determine his position, and he wasn't going to have that. But then Napoleon didn't actually last very long, but that's a totally different story. But I love this image. That's supposed to be the crown of thorns that's being carried, but you can see the combination of actual painting on glass and colored glass. It's not all colored glass. You don't get those faces. You had someone painted that on there to get those details.
That green thing is the crown.
This is the crown of thorns. I know, it's exactly what it looks like. I think that's what they're supposed to symbolize. I think that's what a Christmas tree symbolizes, the crown of thorns. But yeah, it does look more like that.
No, I didn't know that.
You were today years ago.
At least there is one thing you will remember now from this class
Wow, I
forever.
still don't know who Jesse is.
Oh, it's the Old Testament stuff, The founder of the line he's the father of King David. That's really his only claim to fame, right? He's the father of David. That's his importance. King David.
I don't remember him at all.
I'm sure there's more, but I don't remember. You don't follow him on Twitter or whatever.
Not really.
Yeah.
Not my
So,
feed.
yeah, no, yeah. Well, it's interesting. Everybody should read the Old Testament sometime.
I have.
But it's really complicated.
I remember.
I know, me too. I have pages and pages of notes, but unless I go back and study them, I'll never remember. So Louis IX comes back. So he's got the crown of thorns. I mean, is there a better holy relic? I mean, other than the body of Christ itself. So where am I going to put it? I can't just put this in a church. So he builds a holy relic around it, for it. And that is the very famous Sainte-Chapelle. Sainte-Chapelle today is one of the most beautiful little chapels. It's not far, it's right across from Notre Dame, and it's stunningly beautiful. It's not really a church, it's a reliquary. It's a huge walk-in reliquary that's all stained glass all the way around, and it was built to house the crown of thorns. As a building, it is the most beautiful stained glass you're ever going to see anywhere, because it's just solid stained glass.
Inside that little building, where is the crown of thorns?
Oh, where was the crown of thorns?
Yeah, I don't know.
Where was the crown of thorns before it came to Constantinople?
It was in Jerusalem, is all I know. They took it from somewhere in Jerusalem, and I don't know who.
Who had some kind of a salesman there?
Well, it could, I mean, historically, we know there was a person named Jesus. I mean, this is not, I mean, we know that. And that person may very well have had a crown of thorns. I mean, there may very well be truth there. Whether that crown of, I don't know enough. I'm not saying nobody knows. I'm saying I don't know enough about how it got from the crucifixion to Jerusalem. So that's where the gap is. I don't know if anyone, well, no, it might have been, there might have been people there who cared.
Well, I would think
He had
that his
apostles at that
relatives would not
time.
wanted to had anything to do with it. But, you know.
I mean, he had apostles who were followers, so that may very well be the same one. I don't know. What do I know? But we know we can track the art history talk. We can track the provenance to Jerusalem, 1063. We can't track the provenance. At least I can't track the provenance before that. But look at this stained glass. That's absolutely stunning.
And you're saying the black parts on that stained glass are concrete?
No, they're lead. Oh, good point. Let me go back to where I can find the front. The earliest, I don't know, this window may have been added later. I don't know if that's stained glass. That's a Romanesque facade, but that round window may have added stone glass. The earlier ones were created with concrete in between the stained glass. The later they get, there's more and more glass to where there's just little strips of lead, and the very latest ones are very lace-like strips of lead. There's no dark at all. It's like solid. So you can sort of date them by the amount of the concrete that holds. They stopped using they just got more sophisticated. I mean, you can see even in this window, there's more actual glass than there is in this window. So as time goes on, they've changed. The making of one thing wasn't considered any much more important than the making of something else. Now, I'm going to say cathedrals are an exception to that, because master stonemasons were really important and they were sought after. So there weren't at the very top, there were some that like they would travel. I mean, you're sought after to build, and another town would be looking for you. But in other crafts like icon making or whatever, it's all about how well you do your job. You know, it's about craftsmanship, and a great table maker was just as important a craftsman as a great icon painter. It's just how well you did it. But when you're dealing with the cathedrals, you really are at a different level. And those people, because of the religious nature of what they did, what they were doing was seen as a kind of
It's
worship
interesting.
practice.
We certainly know who Michelangelo was, but we don't know who the stonemason was.
For who?
For the cathedral.
We
For the
don't,
work that
because,
the-
yeah,
we don't know
you
who
were
he was.
anonymous. There's an anonymity because everyone was a man. There's really no conception of art. There's no conception of an artist. You're a master craftsperson, and it has a lot to do with that absence of individuality was seen as important. Like it was egotistical to put yourself out there, put your name on it, and we start to see that happen. I mean, that's one thing that happens in the Renaissance. I mean, Renaissance artists are going to be out there very consciously putting their name on. I mean, their goal was to be famous. No question about it. My goal is, you know who I am and that I did this. And that's a reaction to the
Well,
anonymity.
Wouldn't many of those things also have been done by several people? It was
Oh, hundreds.
a guild. I mean, this was the
Right.
the craftsmen, the stonemasons Union 102.
Right,
was
because
over
one
making that.
person didn't
Yeah.
make it. I mean, even
Yeah.
little
I
icons.
might not have made it, but I tell you what, those buildings are not designed by committees. Those are designed.
Right,
by
those are
individuals.
Those were absolutely overseen by
Oh, yeah.
a master, no question. The building is a whole different sort of hierarchical structure than icon paintings, but and the truth is, people knew the names of the master builders. It may not be written down, but we do know the names of some of them. I don't, I'm not a medievalist. But I'm sure if you took a full medieval course from someone who's a specialty in that field, they could give you a lot more information about some of the people than I can. Because I know there are master builders' names that people know. Any other questions?
I just have a comment here. The
Yeah.
Washington
Yay.
Cathedral was, I'll just read you. It says construction began in 1907 when the foundation stone was laid in the
For what?
present.
What was this for? What was this for?
The Washington Cathedral in
Oh,
Washington.
Washington.
Yeah. So it was started in 1907, and some of you may have visited that during this process. The foundation stone was laid in 1907 in the presence of Theodore Roosevelt. A crowd of more than 20,000. Construction ended 83 years later when the final finale was placed. Finale, F-I-N-I-A-L.
Finial.
Placed. Yeah, Fennel. Okay, was placed in the presence of President George W. Bush in 1990.
Wow.
Took a long time.
And that's for us with our
Yeah.
modern technology.
Which is a lot more amazing when some of those cathedrals though only took, 15, 20, 25 years. Some of them did. And some of
Yeah.
them are still being built.
So I
Right.
think I read one time that Salisbury Cathedral is the same everywhere. It's built.
It's
from
all
And it took 150 years, and that's very, very quickly.
Yeah.
They took hundreds of years mostly.
Well, because they were always repairing and rebuilding different styles, and they didn't seem to have a problem with putting one style on another style. I mean, they didn't have the art issues with that, but that's another story entirely. So what we're gonna do next time is look at the rebirth of sculpture. Large scale sculpture on Gothic cathedrals begins. Painting revives, large scale painting for the first time. So by the 13th century, we're seeing all sorts of hints that things are changing dramatically. The 14th century is totally transitional. 14th century is late Gothic, with some people doing things that we're going to see as Renaissance. So it's a very transitional period. So changes are happening by the 13th and 14th centuries. So we're going to see the revival of painting, revival of large scale sculpture, and the revival of interest in looking at the world and seeing what things really look like again for the first time. It tells you a lot of thought has changed. So we will definitely be finishing up and beginning the early Renaissance next time. So I'll have a new handout for you by next week.
Thank you. Betty.
Okay, you are welcome. Thank you all.